On the night of November 11, 2022, in the small, quiet town of Sanford, Florida, a young mother's life was stolen away in a way that would shake the community to its core. Kaylin Fiengo, an 18-year-old woman, was found dead in her car, a victim of a fatal gunshot wound, her second child lost in the process. But this story is more than just the tragedy of a mother and child taken too soon. It is a story of domestic violence, of coercion, of the tension between love and control, and of a deep, disturbing conflict that culminated in the violent death of a woman who simply wanted to hold on to her future. Kaylin's ex-boyfriend, 21-year-old Donovan Faison, had been pressuring her to end her pregnancy, a demand Kaylin had refused to entertain. A refusal that would set in motion a series of events leading to her tragic end. A tragic yet chillingly avoidable act. What led up to that fateful meeting in Coastline Park? What drove Donovan Faison to make the choice to end Kaylin's life? Tonight we will explore the harrowing case of Kaylin Fiengo, a victim not just of violence but of a deeper, more insidious kind of manipulation, reproductive coercion. This case calls into question the depths of human control and the tragic consequences of ignoring the early signs of abuse and manipulation in relationships. As we unpack this story, we'll explore the investigation that followed her death. For nearly 10 months, authorities worked tirelessly to gather evidence, uncovering more than anyone could have anticipated. And while Kaylin's life may have ended that night, the story doesn't end there. This investigation would reveal a web of lies, and the community would come face to face with a truth that was as unsettling as it was heartbreaking. If you find yourself intrigued by these stories, the ones that make you pause and reflect, this is a journey you won't want to miss. So, grab your seat because we're about to get into the chilling details. If you enjoy deep dives into true crime stories, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another episode. Kaylin Fiengo had just begun to navigate life's greatest challenge, motherhood, when her world was ripped apart. At just 18 years old, she was already the proud mother of a young son and expecting a second child, a boy she was excited to welcome into her life. Her family described her as loving, determined, and full of promise. She had big dreams for herself and her children, dreams that were abruptly shattered one cold November evening in 2022. Sanford, Florida, was the backdrop to Kaylin's life, a quiet city in Seminole County, tucked away in Central Florida. The kind of place where neighbors knew each other, where the streets were familiar, and the sunsets over Lake Monroe were peaceful and calming. But beneath this peaceful exterior, something far darker had been simmering in Kaylin's personal life, something that would soon shatter the sense of tranquility that once defined her world. Kaylin's relationship with Donovan Faison, the 21-year-old father of her unborn child, had been a turbulent one. They had been together for a time and like many young couples their relationship had its ups and downs. But for Kaylin the issues with Donovan ran deeper than what a typical relationship might face. In fact, their relationship was increasingly marked by a stark imbalance of power, emotional manipulation, and ultimately coercion. Donovan had a history that would later come into sharper focus during the investigation. He was known to be controlling, possessive, and aggressive. And in the months leading up to that fateful night, he had become more insistent on a decision that would change the course of their lives forever. He demanded that Kaylin abort their unborn child. Kaylin, however, was resolute. She had already made up her mind that she wanted to keep the baby and build a life for her growing family. But Donovan's pressure was relentless. He couldn't understand why she wouldn't comply with his wishes. His coercion didn't just come through words, it came through manipulation, threats, and an overwhelming sense of control. To him, it didn't matter that Kaylin had a right to choose her future. What mattered was his own desires, his own plans, and the twisted need to make Kaylin bend to his will. But Kaylin was strong. She knew what she wanted and she wasn't about to let him dictate her choices. She fought for her autonomy, for her family's future. But in doing so, she unknowingly set the stage for the violence that would follow. Donovan's behavior had always been a bit erratic, but as time passed, it became more clear that his control over Kaylin's life was growing increasingly dangerous. He couldn't accept her decision to keep the child, and in his mind, her refusal was an affront to his authority. His need for control soon escalated from emotional manipulation to outright threats. While Kaylin had friends and family who supported her, Donovan's pressure was constant. Friends of Kaylin later revealed that she had expressed fear of what might happen if she didn't comply with him. But she didn't share the full extent of her concerns, and those around her didn't have a clear picture of just how far Donovan was willing to go. By the time November rolled around, the tension between them had reached a breaking point. Kaylin, despite the emotional toll the relationship was taking on her, had made arrangements to meet Donovan at Coastline Park in Sanford, a place that should have been a peaceful spot for a conversation but would soon become the site of her final moments. It was on this night, November 11, 2022, that Kaylin's life would tragically come to an end. A mother, fighting for her right to keep her child, would be violently silenced by the one person she once trusted. Coastline Park, located along the serene waters of Lake Monroe, was a place of quiet beauty. Its walking trails, wide open spaces, and views of the lake made it a popular location for those seeking a bit of tranquility away from the bustle of daily life. At night, the park became a dimly lit retreat, with only the distant hum of traffic to remind visitors that they were in the heart of Sanford. The cool air off the water and the rustling of the trees would have seemed peaceful on any other day, but for Kaylin Fiengo, this would not be a peaceful evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Kaylin met Donovan in the park to have a conversation. What was intended to be a discussion about the future of their family quickly turned into an argument. Donovan, as he had done before, began to pressure her to end the pregnancy. He insisted yet again that she terminate the child, just as he had demanded time and time again. But Kaylin stood her ground. She refused to give in to his demands. What happened next is still under investigation, but the result is all too clear. Kaylin, seated in her car, was shot at close range. She was defenseless, sitting in the place she had thought would provide some level of safety, only to become the target of an act of brutal violence. A passing police officer later discovered her lifeless body, a tragic end to a life that had so much potential. Donovan Faison's actions that night were the culmination of months of emotional abuse and coercion. His decision to take Kaylin's life wasn't born out of a single moment of anger. It was the product of a deeply troubled mindset, one that placed control over another person as his primary goal. The tragedy wasn't just in the taking of a life, it was in the failure to see the warning signs of a relationship spiraling into violence. And for Kaylin, there would be no chance to recover from it. But what happened after the crime is just as important as the crime itself. It would take months for the authorities to piece together the details of what had occurred that night. But the investigation that followed would reveal shocking details. Details that no one could have predicted and that would leave the community stunned and mourning. As we move forward, we will examine how the investigation unfolded and how Kaylin's tragic death would ultimately lead to the arrest of Donovan Faison. We'll take you through the painstaking process of uncovering the truth and, with it, the full scope of the crime that had shattered so many lives. Stay with us as we continue this haunting journey. It was a cold, dark evening in Sanford, Florida, when the quiet of Coastline Park was shattered by an act of violence that would reverberate throughout the community. The park, known for its peaceful views of Lake Monroe and its serene walking paths, had long been a place of solace for local residents, until November 11, 2022. That night, Coastline Park would become the setting for a tragedy that would change the lives of many forever. Kaylin Fiengo had arranged to meet Donovan Faison at the park. The purpose was clear: they needed to talk. The pregnancy she was carrying, the child that Donovan had demanded she abort, was still a point of contention between them. Kaylin had made her decision. She wanted to keep the baby despite the pressure from Donovan. What should have been a civil conversation about their future quickly escalated into something far darker. According to police reports, Kaylin had driven to Coastline Park in her car, a place she likely thought would be neutral ground to have an important discussion. Donovan, on the other hand, had driven separately, likely expecting the same, a conversation that would allow him to convince her to do as he wished. As the two met at the park, the tension was palpable. What began as an exchange of words soon turned heated. Donovan, desperate to assert his control over the situation, demanded again that Kaylin end her pregnancy. His coercion had been ongoing for months, but this time, it seemed, was the breaking point. According to witnesses and evidence later gathered during the investigation, Donovan's insistence had grown more aggressive over time. "Why won't you just listen to me?" Donovan allegedly shouted during their heated discussion, his frustration growing as Kaylin held firm to her decision to keep the child. "This is what's best for you. You're ruining everything." His words, laced with anger, echoed in the still air of the park. Kaylin, according to those who spoke with her later, was resolute. "I'm not going to end the pregnancy," she said firmly. "This is my choice." The argument escalated rapidly, with Donovan's demands growing more desperate and forceful. Kaylin's refusal to comply with his wishes enraged him. The very thought that she would reject his ultimatum seemed to send him into a violent frenzy. He was no longer pleading with her. He was demanding, threatening. And when she continued to stand her ground, when she once again rejected his control over her body and her future, the situation took a tragic turn. The details of what happened next are both chilling and heartbreaking. In the midst of their argument, Donovan allegedly pulled out a firearm, a gun that had been hidden from view. It's unclear whether Kaylin ever saw it coming, but the next moments unfolded with terrifying speed. According to the police report, witnesses who were nearby heard a single gunshot ring out into the night air. The shot was loud enough to echo across the empty park, a chilling reminder of the violence that had just taken place. Kaylin, seated in the driver's seat of her car, was struck by the bullet. She had no chance to defend herself. She slumped forward in her seat, lifeless, as the reality of the situation began to set in. Donovan, realizing what he had done, likely panicked. The exact moments after the shot were unclear, but witnesses reported seeing him flee the scene in a hurry, leaving Kaylin behind in her car. Her body, now cold and motionless, would remain there until it was discovered by a patrolling officer hours later. The discovery of Kaylin's body was, as you can imagine, nothing short of haunting. The officer who found her was patrolling the park, a routine check at around 2 a.m., when he noticed something out of place. The car, parked in an isolated part of the park, seemed abandoned. As he approached the vehicle, the eerie silence that had already settled in the park was shattered by the realization that something was terribly wrong. Peering into the driver's side window, the officer immediately saw Kaylin's lifeless body. The car's interior was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of street lamps from a distance. Her hands were still gripping the steering wheel, a stark contrast to the stillness of her body. A single gunshot wound to the chest was visible. She had been shot at point-blank range. Without hesitation, the officer called for backup, and within minutes, the park became the scene of a thorough investigation. The initial moments were filled with confusion. Was this a robbery gone wrong? Was it an accidental shooting? But the nature of the crime quickly became evident. The angle of the shot, the absence of any signs of a struggle, and the apparent execution-style nature of the killing led authorities to believe this was no random act of violence. This was something more calculated. Kaylin had been murdered, and the circumstances of her death were both chilling and, in hindsight, all too predictable. As police worked quickly to secure the crime scene, investigators began to piece together the details of the events leading up to Kaylin's death. It was clear that this was not a random act of violence. Kaylin's relationship with Donovan Faison, her ex-boyfriend, had been troubled for months, and it was now becoming evident that the pressure he had been placing on her to abort their child had spiraled out of control. One crucial detail that surfaced during the investigation was the fact that Kaylin had been alone when she was shot. She was sitting in her car, a place where she had likely thought she would be safe. But Donovan had followed her there, bringing with him the violence that had festered throughout their relationship. Forensic evidence, including gunshot residue found on Donovan's clothing, later confirmed that he was the one who had pulled the trigger that night. But at the time, police had no idea where he had gone after fleeing the scene. The manhunt began almost immediately, and as the investigation gained traction, the details of what had happened in Coastline Park became clearer with each passing hour. Donovan Faison, now a prime suspect, was nowhere to be found. The hunt for him became a focal point of the investigation, with local law enforcement working tirelessly to track him down. For nearly 10 months, detectives would follow leads, interview witnesses, and sift through evidence to build the case against him. The scene at Coastline Park, where Kaylin's life had been taken so callously, was the beginning of a long and painful road for investigators and for Kaylin's family. As the investigation unfolded, it became increasingly clear that Donovan Faison's motivations were rooted in control and coercion, an inability to accept Kaylin's autonomy, her right to make decisions for herself and her unborn child. The discovery of Kaylin's body was just the beginning of a complex investigation, one that would eventually lead to the arrest of the man who had once been a part of her life, but who, in the end, would be the one to take it away. As we move forward in this story, we'll explore the investigation itself, the painstaking work that went into uncovering the truth, and the eventual arrest of Donovan Faison. But for now, the silence of Coastline Park remains a stark reminder of the violence that occurred there on that tragic night. As the first rays of dawn began to break over Coastline Park, the discovery of Kaylin Fiengo's lifeless body marked the beginning of a long, arduous journey for law enforcement. A seemingly routine patrol by a Sanford police officer quickly turned into a haunting and tragic discovery that would set the course for an investigation unlike any other. The officer, who had been conducting his rounds at around 2 a.m., was drawn to the car parked alone in the park. Initially, there was nothing about the vehicle that seemed out of place. But as he approached, he saw through the window the unmistakable sign of something far more sinister. The sight of Kaylin's body, slumped over the steering wheel, caused the officer to immediately call for backup. It was clear that what he was witnessing was not a routine incident, it was a crime scene. Within moments, more officers arrived, sealing off the area and securing the scene. The air was thick with the tension of the unknown, and there was an immediate sense of urgency. Kaylin had been shot, but the full details of her death were still unclear. Was this a random act of violence? While a small victory was only the beginning of another long process, the legal proceedings that would determine Faison's fate. The investigation into Kaylin's death, though fraught with difficulties, had ultimately led to a moment of justice. But the road had been long, filled with obstacles and frustrations. It was a case that highlighted both the complexity of domestic violence and reproductive coercion, and the challenges faced by law enforcement in investigating such heinous acts. As we move on to the next chapter of this story, we'll explore the trial that followed, how the legal system would take on the responsibility of deciding Faison's future and, more importantly, the justice that Kaylin and her unborn child so rightfully deserved. As the investigation came to a close with Donovan Faison's arrest, the real battle began. For Kaylin Fiengo and her unborn child, justice was now in the hands of the legal system. The charges brought against Faison were grave, and the courtroom drama that would unfold would not only affect the immediate parties involved but also ripple through the community and beyond. Donovan Faison was formally charged with first-degree premeditated murder for the killing of Kaylin Fiengo and second-degree murder for the death of her unborn child, an act known as killing an unborn child by injury to the mother. The gravity of these charges set the stage for what would become a complex and emotional trial, not just for the family and friends of the victim but for the entire Sanford community. The decision to indict Faison on these charges came after an extensive review of the evidence gathered by investigators over the months following Kaylin's death. On August 29, 2023, after a thorough investigation by law enforcement and a deliberation by the Seminole County Grand Jury, Faison was officially indicted. The charges were clear: first-degree premeditated murder for the fatal shooting of Kaylin, and the second-degree charge related to the tragic loss of her unborn child. It was a case that would draw attention not only because of the brutal nature of the crime but because it involved the very sensitive issue of reproductive coercion, an issue that would resonate with many women and advocates for women's rights. Faison's coercion of Kaylin to terminate her pregnancy, coupled with the deadly actions he took when she refused, added a layer of complexity to the case. The legal team now had to grapple with the emotional and legal nuances of this charge, which had ramifications far beyond just the murder of Kaylin herself. As the trial date approached, both sides began preparing their arguments, each shaping their strategy around the core aspects of the case: Faison's intention and whether his actions could be classified as premeditated. Prosecutors emphasized the history of coercion and control exerted by Faison over Kaylin, his refusal to accept her decision to keep the baby, and the fact that he had driven her to a secluded location where the murder occurred. All these details painted a picture of a calculated, premeditated act. For the defense, the task was to challenge the prosecution's narrative of premeditation. Faison's defense team argued that there was insufficient evidence to prove that the shooting was premeditated, that it could have been an impulsive act during a moment of intense emotional strain. The defense sought to paint the picture of a young man who, while clearly troubled, acted out of a complicated emotional state, not with the cold and deliberate intent required for a first-degree murder conviction. The courtroom drama unfolded over several weeks, with moments that gripped the audience, as witnesses took the stand to testify about what they knew of the relationship between Kaylin and Faison. One of the most significant testimonies came from Kaylin's close friends and family members. They spoke candidly about Kaylin's hopes for the future, her dreams of raising both of her children, and the strain that Donovan's repeated demands for an abortion had placed on her emotionally and mentally. Through their eyes, the jury saw not just a tragic victim but a young woman who had fought to maintain control over her own life and decisions, right up until her final moments. Forensic experts also took the stand, explaining in graphic detail how the evidence pointed to Faison as the killer. They described the gunshot residue found on his clothing and the forensic analysis that placed him at the scene of the crime. But it was the testimony of the lead investigator in the case, Detective Sarah Daniels, that really seemed to shift the tide in favor of the prosecution. She detailed the months-long investigation and explained the meticulous work that had gone into identifying Faison as the prime suspect. She described the surveillance footage that had captured Faison entering the park on the night of the murder and the phone records that showed his escalating efforts to pressure Kaylin into terminating the pregnancy. Detective Daniel's emotional recounting of the case underscored the tragic nature of Kaylin's death and the complex layers of control and violence that led to it. Faison himself took the stand in his own defense. His demeanor was calm, almost distant, as he claimed that he never intended to kill Kaylin, offering a narrative of a relationship gone wrong. But his words rang hollow as the evidence against him mounted. His inability to offer a coherent explanation for his actions and the lack of any emotional response to the death of Kaylin left the courtroom in a tense silence. The role of the media was significant throughout the trial. Local and national outlets covered every moment, shaping public opinion and keeping the case at the forefront of people's minds. Some outlets painted Faison as a troubled young man who had been pushed to the edge by an unexpected and unwanted pregnancy, while others took a harsher view, focusing on the brutality of his actions and the callousness with which he had ended Kaylin's life. The coverage sparked intense debates, particularly around the issue of reproductive rights and coercion. Many advocates for women's rights highlighted the case as a tragic example of how reproductive coercion can lead to violence. Kaylin's refusal to give in to Faison's demands for an abortion had, in the eyes of many, set in motion a chain of events that led to her death, making the case a rallying cry for those seeking stronger legal protections for women facing similar pressures. As the trial progressed, the tension in the courtroom continued to rise. It became clear that this was not just about the loss of one life, it was about the loss of a future, a child never given the chance to be born, and a young woman's dreams dashed in a senseless act of violence. The prosecution pushed hard for a conviction on the most serious charges, seeking justice not only for Kaylin but for her unborn child as well. The defense, on the other hand, leaned heavily into the emotional volatility of the situation, arguing that Faison had not premeditated the crime and that his actions were more a result of emotional outbursts than calculated malice. Yet, as the case went on, it became harder and harder to deny the cold and deliberate actions that led to Kaylin's death. The narrative of premeditation began to stick. Finally, after weeks of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. Donovan Faison was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder for the death of Kaylin Fiengo and second-degree murder for the killing of her unborn child. The courtroom was filled with emotion as the verdict was read. Kaylin's family, some of whom had attended every day of the trial, finally found a sense of closure. The weight of their loss would never be lifted, but they had seen justice served. They left the courtroom with mixed emotions, grief for the loss of a daughter, sister, and mother, but a sense of relief that the man responsible for her death would face the full consequences of his actions. Faison's defense team immediately announced their intention to appeal the verdict, arguing that the conviction for first-degree murder was too harsh given the circumstances. But in the eyes of the public and Kaylin's family, the justice had been served. The sentencing phase of the trial was equally poignant. Faison stood before the judge, his expression unchanged as the sentence was handed down. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Kaylin, and an additional sentence for the killing of her unborn child. The judge's words were firm, but the reality of what had been lost weighed heavily on everyone in the room. Kaylin's family expressed their sorrow, but they also expressed hope that the outcome would shine a light on the issue of domestic violence and reproductive coercion, urging others to speak out against such threats before it's too late. The case of Kaylin Fiengo and her unborn child is one that will remain etched in the memory of the Sanford community. A mother taken too soon. A child never given the chance to live. And a man whose refusal to accept the choices of the woman he claimed to love led to tragedy. The trial may have ended, but the impact of this case will continue to resonate for years to come. As we move forward in the aftermath of this tragedy, the question remains, how many more stories like Kaylin's are out there? How many more women are being coerced, controlled, and victimized in the name of power? It is up to all of us to ensure that their voices are heard, and their stories are told so that something like this never happens again. In the end, justice was served, but the cost was immeasurable. The case of Kaylin Fiengo's tragic death left an indelible mark on the Sanford community, a community that had known Kaylin, a young mother with a bright future ahead of her who was taken far too soon. In the wake of her death, emotions ran high, and the questions surrounding the case didn't just linger in the minds of those who knew her. They echoed throughout the town, sparking debates about domestic violence, reproductive rights, and the very nature of coercion in intimate relationships. For the residents of Sanford, Florida, this tragedy hit close to home. Many who had lived in the community for years spoke of the shock they felt when they first learned of Kaylin's murder. She was a familiar face, a young woman full of promise who had made the difficult but courageous decision to become a mother at such a young age. To hear that her life was taken so brutally, and in the middle of such a personal struggle, left the community devastated. Friends, family, and even strangers who had followed the case from the beginning mourned not only the loss of Kaylin but the life that had been taken with her, her unborn child. The loss was felt on a personal level by so many, and the emotional toll was profound. The grief that followed was not simply that of a mother and her child being stolen away, but of a sense of betrayal by a man who had once been trusted and loved, but who turned his back on both Kaylin and their unborn child in the most unimaginable way. As the case progressed through the legal system, it became clear that it wasn't just Kaylin's family and friends who were impacted, it was the entire community. The trial and its subsequent media coverage acted as a harsh reminder of the widespread problem of domestic violence and coercion, issues that had for too long been left in the shadows. In response to this tragedy, local organizations and community leaders rallied together to bring awareness to domestic violence and reproductive coercion. Kaylin's case was used as an example of how coercion in relationships can have deadly consequences. Support groups for women facing similar pressures began to grow, and advocacy organizations pushed for stronger legal protections against coercion and reproductive abuse. The Sanford Police Department and other local law enforcement agencies partnered with these organizations to host events and raise awareness about the importance of recognizing the early warning signs of domestic abuse and controlling behavior. The case prompted a series of discussions on the steps that needed to be taken to prevent more tragedies like Kaylin's, and the community collectively vowed to honor her memory by ensuring that her death was not in vain. Kaylin Fiengo's death did not only leave a void in the lives of those who knew her, it also spurred legal and societal change. The case highlighted an issue that had long been underreported: reproductive coercion. While domestic violence had long been recognized as a societal issue, reproductive coercion, the act of pressuring or forcing a partner into an abortion or other reproductive decisions, had not received the same level of attention. Kaylin's refusal to terminate her pregnancy, coupled with Faison's violent actions in the face of her decision, became a focal point for legal reform. As the trial gained national attention, legislators and activists began to examine whether current laws surrounding domestic violence and reproductive rights were adequate to protect victims from coercive tactics like those employed by Faison. Advocates for women's rights pushed for stronger legislation that would criminalize reproductive coercion, making it a standalone offense. They argued that the legal system needed to acknowledge the unique ways in which control and manipulation can manifest in intimate relationships, especially when it comes to reproductive decisions. In Florida, the case prompted lawmakers to revisit existing domestic violence laws, leading to the drafting of new legislation aimed at providing better support for victims of coercive control, particularly when the coercion revolves around reproductive choices. Additionally, several organizations, both local and national, began working on creating educational programs to help both women and men recognize the warning signs of reproductive coercion and manipulation. It became clear that Kaylin's case had opened a door to a larger conversation about the intersection of intimate partner violence, reproductive rights, and coercion. For many, this tragedy was a wake-up call, a call to action that could not be ignored. Theories surrounding Faison's motivations. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the motivations behind Faison's actions became the subject of intense scrutiny. The evidence against him was clear, and his role in the murder of Kaylin and her unborn child seemed indisputable. However, as the case progressed, many began to wonder, what exactly drove Faison to take such extreme measures? Several theories emerged as to why Faison would have acted so violently, especially in the face of a difficult but manageable situation. One theory that surfaced was that Faison may have been acting out of deep emotional instability. Those close to him suggested that he had exhibited troubling behaviors even before the pregnancy, including possessiveness and an unwillingness to accept Kaylin's independence. His repeated demands for an abortion, despite Kaylin's clear refusal, indicated that he may have viewed the pregnancy as an obstacle to his own desires, rather than a shared responsibility. Psychologists speculated that Faison's behavior may have been the result of what some experts called toxic masculinity, a concept that describes certain societal pressures that encourage men to assert control in relationships and suppress their vulnerabilities. It is possible that Faison felt an overwhelming need to assert power and control over Kaylin, especially as she made a decision that conflicted with his own desires. In his mind, the pregnancy was a threat to his autonomy, and his response, violent and tragic as it was, could be seen as an attempt to regain control. Another theory focused on Faison's history of manipulative behavior. He had been reportedly pressuring Kaylin to end the pregnancy for some time, and those who knew him described him as having an unyielding attitude when it came to getting what he wanted. Some argued that his inability to cope with rejection and his refusal to accept Kaylin's decision might have triggered a violent outburst. His actions could have been seen not as a momentary lapse in judgment but as part of a larger pattern of controlling behavior. However, there was also a theory that Faison's actions might have been influenced by external pressures, such as personal problems or a troubled upbringing. Some speculated that he may have been struggling with unresolved emotional issues, which contributed to his inability to understand the consequences of his actions. Despite these various theories, the truth of Faison's motivations remains elusive. While it's clear that his actions were driven by some form of emotional and psychological turmoil, the exact nature of that turmoil remains a matter of speculation. What we do know is that his decision to kill Kaylin and her unborn child was not an isolated incident but the culmination of a series of coercive actions, emotional manipulation, and a complete disregard for Kaylin's autonomy in her life. Theories aside, one thing is certain: Kaylin Fiengo's death was not inevitable. It was the result of a toxic relationship dynamic fueled by coercion and control. In the aftermath of her death, both the community and the legal system were left to pick up the pieces and confront the difficult realities of domestic violence and reproductive coercion. And as we reflect on her story, we are reminded that while justice has been served, the work of preventing such tragedies from occurring again is far from over. The impact of Kaylin's case, both legally and socially, continues to reverberate. Her story has become a rallying cry for the victims of domestic violence and reproductive coercion, a reminder that more needs to be done to protect the most vulnerable from the toxic behaviors that too often lead to violence and death. And so, as we close this chapter, we are left with a sobering reminder that true justice does not just lie in the courtroom, it lies in the collective effort to ensure that no one else has to face the same fate as Kaylin. The true work begins when we recognize the signs of coercion and control, when we stand up for the rights of women and men alike, and when we vow to prevent another life from being taken in such a senseless and violent way. Kaylin Fiengo's life may have been cut short, but her legacy lives on through the lessons we continue to learn and the changes we continue to make. As we reflect on the tragic case of Kaylin Fiengo, we must acknowledge the wider implications it carries for our society, particularly concerning domestic violence, reproductive rights, and coercion. Kaylin's death shines a harsh light on the dangerous and often hidden dynamics of control and manipulation that occur within intimate relationships. Her story has brought these issues to the forefront, forcing many to confront uncomfortable truths about the pervasive nature of domestic violence, especially when it involves reproductive coercion. This case has sparked vital conversations about the need for stronger laws and support systems to protect individuals from coercion, whether it be about pregnancy, personal autonomy, or intimate decisions. It's a sobering reminder of the importance of early intervention, public awareness, and the collective responsibility to help victims break free from cycles of control and violence. Kaylin's tragic end is not just a call for justice for her, but a call to action for all of us. It asks us to do more, to protect those who may be suffering in silence, to listen to the signs of abuse, and to hold perpetrators accountable for their actions. This case has left us all with the unsettling reality that while justice may be served, it is the broader societal change that is needed to truly prevent such tragedies in the future. As we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to ask you, the audience, to reflect with us. What do you think about how the justice system handled this case? Do you feel that the punishment matches the severity of the crime? And more importantly, what can we as a society do to ensure that this kind of tragedy does not happen again? Please share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Your input is invaluable, and it's important that we continue this conversation. Let's keep the dialogue going so that we can learn from Kaylin's story and help raise awareness about the dangers of domestic violence and reproductive coercion. And if you found this case compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth true crime stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.